I want to welcome you to our class this morning in Bible prophecy. We're going to be, we were talking about Revelation 4, 5, and 6 last time. But in Revelation chapter 6, where the seven seals were opened, I want to go back and pick up, kind of parenthetically, Ezekiel 37 and 38 and maybe a little bit into 39. The reason is because one of the seals that is opened, and that's the second seal, is the red horse, or war. And I've been seeing a lot on YouTube about the war of Gog and Magog. Has anybody been seeing that a lot? And so I wanted to explain what I believe and when that war will happen, and I'm going to give you some other perspectives on it of when it's going to be, because nobody knows for sure. But following the Revelation, with the seals being opened, see, the seals won't be opened until in the tribulation period. So I believe that the second seal, which is war, is going to be this war. And it'll be the Gog and Magog war. And that means that the church is already gone in heaven when this war or this battle begins. So we have to go back to 37, Ezekiel 37, and start there with the vision of the valley of dry bones. And the reason is because this tells us that Israel has to be back in the land for this war of Gog and Magog to take place. So therefore, this battle will occur sometimes between the time that Israel returned and when Israel gets saved. And Israel wasn't going to get saved till the tribulation and into the millennium. So in Zechariah 12, verse 10, it says that they will look upon whom they have pierced and will mourn for him as their only son. So that's when national Israel gets saved. Now, let's look at when the national resurrection of Israel occurred. Ezekiel 37. The hand of the Lord came upon me and brought me out in the spirit of the Lord and set me down in the midst of the valley, and it was full of bones. Now, this is when Ezekiel was in captivity in Babylon. Remember, Daniel and Ezekiel were in captivity at the same time, and they were both prophesying. In the spirit, Ezekiel says, God took me out and set me in a valley of dry bones. And he caused me to pass by them all around. And behold, there were very many in the open valley, and indeed they were very dry. Now, I want to give you a picture of that, because that just is a vivid picture to me of the concentration camps. That Eisenhower made the German people go out and look at what those Nazis had done to the Jews.
I did not hear that.
Yeah, Eisenhower and General Patton made the German people that were living in these cities prospering, while these people down here in these concentration camps were being murdered by the millions. And so when Eisenhower and Patton came into Germany in 1945, they took those leaders and all of the people that lived in that city one by one and made them file through those concentration camps. And Eisenhower said, I want you guys to he ordered his photographers to take all the pictures you can, all the video reels you can, because there'll come a time when people will deny this. We're living in that time right now.
Yes, we are.
When the liberals in Israel and liberals in the United States and other places are denying that this Holocaust even took place. I've been to two Holocaust museums, and I walked through it, and I can tell you it took place. There's one in Washington, D.C., and also one in Jerusalem. If you have never been there, it's a place to see of what the atrocities that the Nazis did. I was listening to, have y'all been watching any about Judge Brown, Joe Brown, from California? You've seen any of his things that he talks about? He was a judge in San Francisco. And he said, he was doing an interview. I watched it yesterday, matter of fact, this interview. And he said 90 years ago, of September, was the Nazis taking away all the guns of the German people. 90 years ago. 3 years before that, they proclaimed a time of joy and restoration to their country. And what they were doing, they took everybody's rights away and burned all the Jewish books. And then Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda ministry, blamed all of the problems that Germany was having on the Jew.
Sure.
And they said, those Jews down there in those banks are your problem. And they're like a bunch of rats, and we need to exterminate them all.
Those mega people.
So what they were trying to do is tell the German people that the Jews were like rats, and it was okay to exterminate them. And so they came on, Hitler began to take over. Well, that Holocaust happened. And this, I believe, is the vision that Ezeikel saw in the Valley of Dry Bones. No other time in history has this kind of event happened where there have been 6 million Jews exterminated. Now, a lot of them were incinerated in the ovens. I remember my mother and dad went out to 2 of them, Auschwitz, and they went to Belsenstein or something. They went to another one, and they had these ovens there, and they were just putting people. What they did, they let them off these trains into these showers, and told everybody they had to go in the shower and get washed off for lice. Stripped everything down they had. Took all their jewelry and everything. Walked them in there, and then they turned on this gas that killed every one of them. Then they hauled them out and put them in ovens. Pretty gruesome, wasn't it? I mean, how could you be a human being and do something like that? So, but by 1944 and 45, they were running out of time to burn them. So what they did, they had to gas them all, and they just stacked them, and they couldn't bury them, so they just stacked them up. And when Eisenhower and them came in, and Patton, and that first one that Patton liberated, he couldn't believe it. They had all these dead people just stacked up. And Eisenhower made those people come down from Germany and dig the graves for them.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. And they were starving to death. They were a man was down to 80 or 90 pounds, just nothing but bones. So they had to be very careful what they fed them, because they could overeat and kill themselves. So it was atrocious to what. But anyway, I believe this is what Ezeikel said. Now he says this. Now let's go to the next verse. He says, "And the Lord said, surely I will cause breath to enter into you, and you shall live." Now he's talking about the national resurrection of the nation of Israel. And he says, "And I will put sinews on you, and bring flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in your mouth, and you shall live. Then you shall know this, that I am the Lord." Verse 10, "So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath came into them, and they lived and stood up, their feet an extremely great army." Now, I've been to Israel twice. Out in front of the Knesset, Great Britain made a great memorial in bronze to Israel. And it's this vision. It's in bronze.
Wow.
The Valley of Dry Bones, and I'm rising up. And they quote that scripture down there. So even the Jews believed that it was the national resurrection of Israel. Now, when did that happen? May 14th, 1948.
Yeah.
That fulfilled a prophecy of the times of the Gentiles. The times of the Gentiles began on Nisan 1, 606 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar came in and surrounded Jerusalem. Nisan 1 is the first day of the month, or the year for them. And that, there are two New Years. One is Tishri, which is, that's the one we'll be celebrating next month. Feast of Trumpets. Rosh Hashanah. But then Nisan is their calendar year type thing. Nisan 1 is when they started things. And so Nisan 1, 606 BC, Nebuchadnezzar surrounded the city and took the freedoms away from Israel. And they, from that point on, never were a sovereign nation again. Until May 14th, 1948. Just so happens. In Grant Jeffrey's book, he wrote on, and Grant Jeffrey has all kinds of charts and timelines and things in his books, that was fulfilling a 2,520-year cycle that God fulfilled. You know, God works in 40-year cycles, 120-year cycles, 490-year cycles, different cycles, 2,520-year cycles. And why was it on May the 14th? Because it had to be to fulfill the cycle, prophetically. So when this occurred on May 14th, 1948, this vision became fulfilled. Because Israel was back in the land now. They have come back, and now they've been migrating in ever since 1948. They've got almost 10 million Jews in there now. They started out with just a handful of Jews that were under the British mandate from 1917. And Great Britain pretty much stabbed them in the back after the war, to let the Jewish people, that was a 3-year period from 45 to 48 that Israel was still under the Jewish mandate. They would only let 1,000 Jews return a month. And they were all trying to get out of Europe and get away from the Nazi concentration stuff and out of the northern countries of Russia and all these places. Britain wouldn't let them in. Y'all might remember the movie Exodus. Did y'all remember that movie?
Yeah.
Well, what that was is a lot of European Jews had left to come back to Israel. But when the Exodus ship, the name of the ship was Exodus, when the Exodus got there, the British wouldn't let them unload, wouldn't let them come in. So it became a world issue. And Truman was president, and he tried to put pressure on the British government to open it up and let them come in, but they wouldn't do it. So what they had to do, they went down to Cyprus and let them all off in Cyprus, and they had to stay down there until 1948, until they became a nation, and then they could immigrate back into the country. But Britain and France stabbed them in the back. Now, why did Britain and France do that? Arab oil.
Yeah.
Saudi Arabians put pressure on Britain and the French not to let the Jews come back in the land. So, and you know, guess who sided up with the Saudis during World War II? Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And I truly believe that's why God took Roosevelt out and put Truman in, because Truman was a Bible-believing Baptist from Independence, Missouri, whose best friend in independence was a Jew. And so Truman knew the Jewish people pretty well. So he promoted the nationalization or the statehood of Israel. You see how God works and puts things into place? Because I can tell you right now, if Roosevelt had stayed in as president and stayed alive, the Jewish state would not have occurred in 1940. Because he was against it. Because of the Arab oil.
Yeah. Money.
Why do you think that George H.W. Bush put so much of a emphasis in 1991 on going into Kuwait? Well, I'll tell you. It all had to do with that oil over there in Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Kuwait. And it was pretty easy to get the, I think you had a 38-nation coalition together for that, because why? All those 38 nations depended on Saudi Arabian oil and Iraqi oil. And so he got all of them together, and they went into Iraq. But what happened was, if you remember the story, and I mentioned it the other night, that we started going into Iraq from Kuwait. The airborne, 82nd Airborne went north, 101st went south, and then they went up the road and crossed over the border into Iraq against the Republican Guard. And I don't know if you remember this, but the B-52s were up there dropping bunker buster bombs, because the Iraqis on the border of Kuwait and Iraq had dug in real deep and were underground. But those B-52s, 30,000 feet up, 6 miles up, with a 25,000-pound bunker buster, went right through that stuff. It created such a concussion that the soldiers couldn't stand it. And they all got out, and if you remember the pictures, when the troops were crossing over, they were all surrendering. They were walking, they wanted to surrender. They said, I want to get out of this mess. Well, that was a 100-hour war, if you remember. Didn't last long. And but as George Bush was getting ready to go into Baghdad to get Saddam Hussein, the United Nations stopped him. Remember that? Didn't get to finish the war. And they decided, well, we know this enemy. We know what he's up to. But if we can corral him up, we'll know. It'll keep Iran from coming over into Iraq. Because Iran and Iraq had been fighting a war in the 80s. And he used poisonous gas on them. So there were weapons of mass destruction being used. Yes. Even on the Iranians' own Kurds. They killed 20,000 Kurds with the gas. So this whole area here was biblically involved. Babylon particularly, because that's where Israel was in captivity for 70 years. And God gave Ezeikel this vision of the dry bones. So the vision was fulfilled in 1948. So Israel has been in the land since May 14th, 1948. We just celebrated, I think, the 80-something birthday of Israel back in the land. I remember a guy wrote a book because it said, Why the Lord Will Return in 1988, because it was the 40th anniversary of Israel being back in the land. Remember that book? Did you ever? I read it.
I didn't read it.
Well, when it didn't happen, they threw stones at him because he was a false prophet. And then I remember the Seventh-day Adventists brought in a prophecy teacher down here in the convention center. And I told everybody in our church, I said, don't go down there and listen to that.
And I didn't.
And I said, don't be giving those people money, because they have a different view of end times than we do, and they're some list them as a cult, some don't. But I list them in our school and a college as a cult, because they worship a different day than we worship, and they worship this person that started this, and his name was White. It started Seventh-day Adventists. So anyway, I got some of their literature, and a lot of times on YouTube you got to be careful, because when you see end time events being taught, you better go and look and see if it's them teaching it, because they do a lot of that to try to gather people into their church or whatever. So okay, now we're gonna skip over in 37 to 38, and this is the war of Gog and Magog. And if you look there at those verses there, it says, let's go down to verse 3. Thus says the Lord God, I am against you, O Gog. Now, Mark Hickok, who is a pretty good prophetic writer, goes back and says that Gog is the title of the person that's in charge of this nation. Gog is not a nation. Gog is a person. I am against you, O Gog. Now, the reason I'm saying it, the prince of Rosh. So a nation can't be a prince, but a person can be a prince. And I until I read his deal, I never saw that. That it's a person, a prince. Of who? Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. Now, if you go back in the old times from those getting off the ark, you have Japheth, Ham, and Shem. Yeah. Each one went to different parts of the world. Shem went over into the land of Canaan. Japheth and Ham went to different places. So, when you go back into the names of the nations that begin to build up, this is the area up around Russia, Iran, and that coalition area up in that area. I think Tubal is even maybe Germany, or in those German areas there. Because Germany and Russia are on the border. They border each other. Because when Hitler invaded Russia, he went over the border into Russia. That's the biggest mistake he ever made. And then the second biggest, trying to take Britain. Because Britain was a praying nation. And God would not let Britain fall because they prayed every day that God would protect them. The whole British people at 9 o'clock, every day, everybody prayed for 1 minute that the Germans would never take Britain. And they had revivals over in Wales and in Sutherland and in Ireland, these great revivals, and these people over here were spirit-filled prayers. They were praying all the time against the Germans. You know, Germany, they came up, they were so cocky, they looked out there and they said, it's only 22 miles across the channel. We'll go in there and bomb them into oblivion and they'll surrender. Well, they took their whole Luftwaffe, their Luftwaffe was their Air Force, under Goering, and he took these big bombers that they had and just sent them out there thinking they'd just go in there and bomb. But God had the Spitfire in Britain. The Spitfire was a better plane than what they had, and Britain just started shooting those things out of the sky like crazy. The other thing that Britain had was radar. So they always had a warning of when those bombers were coming so they could send up those Spitfires. And they caught them. And you might remember this battle was in September 15th, 1940. That they turned the German Luftwaffe back. It's an anniversary today. Wow. And they couldn't take it. They couldn't, and then when they didn't have an Air Force left, they couldn't land their troops. Now I'll tell you another miracle. Was Dunkirk. If you've never seen that movie, you ought to see it.
It's called what?
Dunkirk.
Okay.
Dunkirk, France. Britain had sent 300,000 of their troops across the channel to help the French stop the Germans from coming into France. Well, the German army just started coming across. They crossed that Maginot line that they thought would keep everybody out. Well, they just went around the line and came in. And they backed up the French and the British to Dunkirk. And they were right up against the ocean or the channel. And they had nothing. They ran from everything, left all their equipment. Winston Churchill prayed, and God told him, says, go get every boat that you can find. I don't care what it is. Anybody that can paddle a boat or do a boat, send them over there and pick everybody up. And that's what he did. He made a national plea. He says, everybody's got a fishing boat, anybody's got any kind of boat at all, head to Dunkirk. And let's pick up every person and let's bring them back. Did you know they brought 300,000 people back?
Wow.
And it saved the British Army. I guarantee that Britain would have failed if they had captured all those. Some of them they couldn't save because they were fighting against the Germans to keep them away from the people on the seashore.
Yeah.
A lot of them were French, who then ended up in the resistance. So God told him, he says, go get those and bring them out and bring them back. And it saved the British Army to go to North Africa and different places to fight. But listen to the voice of the Spirit of God. Makes all the difference in the world.
All the difference.
Leaders need to listen to God.
Yes. Amen.
Not man, God.
That's right.
And Churchill made this statement after the Germans had backed off. How did they know they backed off? Because they didn't see any more planes coming. You can imagine what it was like living in Britain.
Oh, yeah.
They took all the women and children out of London and out of the bigger cities and moved them out into the country and hid them out so that they wouldn't die in the Blitz. They called it the Blitz. And everybody had to go down under the ground in these subway channels and things to survive. And then when it came out, everything was burning and they lost their homes. But the British people never quit. And then Churchill made this statement. He says, never is so much owed to so few for such a great victory. And that was those Spitfire pilots and the code breakers and the radar people that picked up on those. So there is a great movie called The Battle of Britain that you can watch, and it's what it was like over there. And that was a time of war. Well, now we see war all the time.
Yes.
And this war here, this Gog and Magog war, is going to be, I believe, after the church is taken out of the earth. Now I'm going to give you, Mark Hickok wrote this, so I'm going to give you some different views of when this battle is going to take place. All right, number one, prior to the rapture, the catching away of the church, prior to the tribulation in 1 Thessalonians 4. Now tonight I'm going to be preaching on that, on live stream. Because nobody, there are a lot of people that still don't believe in the rapture or know what the rapture is. Because it's never taught in their churches. Amillennial churches don't believe in the rapture of the church. Because they said the word of rapture is not in the church, in the Bible. But the word catching away is. And the word caught up is. And guess what that is? That's a Latin and Greek word for rapture.
That's right.
Okay, number two. Between the rapture and the beginning of the tribulation. Well, I don't believe that because that means the church is still in the earth. And I don't believe we're going to see this battle. Number three is during the first half of the tribulation, close to the midpoint. During the first half of the tribulation, close to the midpoint. It could be that. Now that could be. But the church is already gone, see. And that's in the tribulation. The first half is the first 3.5 years. I truly believe that this war is going to happen in the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. Now, he also wrote this, and this is a Jew that wrote this one. I get it out of Prophecy Watchers by Paul Pierce. He's a real good prophecy writer about Israel stuff. And he said that the thing that begins the tribulation period is the signing of the peace treaty of the Antichrist and Israel. Daniel 9:27. That starts the tribulation. And I think you heard Raphael Cruz talk Sunday about the first 3.5 years were going to be a time of more or less some peace, what we call the beginning of sorrows that Jesus talked about in Matthew 24. It won't be in the full tribulation. The bad part is the last 3.5. But I told you Sunday when I taught this, under the seal judgments. When you start reading about the seal judgments, everything there is bad.
Oh, yeah.
Except they opened the seal of number 5, which is the souls under the altar, but that's all these martyred people.
Yeah.
So I think it's all going to be bad. All 7 years is going to be terrible. But there'll be worse parts than others. All right, another one is, at the end of the tribulation, the battle of Armageddon. No, that's not going to be it, because the battle of Armageddon is totally by itself. And that is in Revelation chapter 16 and 19. And then at the beginning of the millennium, 1,000-year reign of Christ. No, it's too late. Way too late. And this is another one, at the end of the millennium. Now remember, there's an uprising at the end of the millennium that Satan goes and collects all those souls of people that didn't want to follow him during tribulation. And during the millennium. And he has an uprising, and Jesus comes down and quashes it, throws them all into a lake of fire. Well, that's a whole different battle. That's not this one. That's a rebellion against Christ's rule for 1,000 years. Those are the people that were born during the millennium, that lived almost 1,000 years, that never wanted to follow him. And Satan was loose from the bottomless pit for a short period of time. And he rounds those people up by deception, and then raises an army against God and against Jerusalem. And Jesus comes down and just like he stopped the battle of Armageddon, speaking the word, the winepress of his wrath, and destroyed all those armies. That's the same thing he'll do here. And then the first phase takes place halfway through the tribulation, and the second phase at the end of the tribulation. Well, that could be. First phase of the war could be in the first part of the tribulation, and maybe end in the last. But I'm still thinking it's going to be between the rapture and the beginning. No, it's during the first half of the tribulation, close to the midpoint. In other words, the church's got to be gone.
Got to be.
And the church will be gone.
Yeah.
And why? Because the second seal is war. And then what follows war? The third seal was what? Famine. Because there may be nuclear fallout that we talked about. The fourth seal was opened is the pale horse, which is death. So from all of the nuclear fallout and all that, 1/4 of the population dies. See, this tribulation is a worldwide event, even though it's directed for Israel. It's a time of purification of Israel, the nation of Israel. And during that time, they will look upon whom they pierced. And about 1 million of them will go to Petra and be hid out and saved. It says 1/3 will come through the tribulation. 2/3 will be lost. And that's in Zechariah chapter 14. It's like right now. How many are going to go to hell in the world today? 2/3. And that's being generous. It might be more than that. Jesus' parable was 25%. The parable of the sower. The sower sows the word. Only 1 heart out of 4 chose to bear good fruit and be a follower. 3 didn't. And that's why he said in Matthew 7, broad is the way to destruction, but narrow is the way to life, and few find it. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That is why it's a narrow gate. And in the wilderness tabernacle, they had the curtains that hung around the tabernacle. These white linen cloths. On the eastern side of it, and Judah was the tribe that faced that eastern side because that's where the Messiah would come out of. That was the only door you could come through, that curtain, to get to the brazen altar, to the laver, to the holy place. Jesus is the way. I remember Benny Hinn he did a 6-part series on just that. The way, the truth, and the life. The way was through the door of the tabernacle to the brazen altar. The truth was the holy place that the priest went into, that had the showbread and the lampstand and the altar of incense. And the life of God was in the Ark of the Covenant, behind the veil. That's why when Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, the Jews knew exactly what he was saying. When he said, I am the vine, they knew exactly what he was saying. Because nothing can live without the sustenance that comes through the vine to the branches. The church is the branches. He's the vine. The church cannot make it without him. There would be no church without him. Okay, I've got to stop here. We'll continue on 38 because I need to get to some other things here. And I laid some groundwork today. Excuse me. I laid some groundwork today. We'll start on chapter 38. What I want to do is run y'all some copies of this so you have some other ammunition, so to speak, of what some other views are. And so, but anyway, I thought, the question was on this. When will God invade Israel? There are many good views, but one seems most logical. The one he says most logical is the one that I just told you. It's right after the rapture of the church. And the first 3.5 years are midpoint, sometime in there of the tribulation period. And the other thing, I got off track. The Antichrist made a treaty with Israel for 7 years to protect them. Because remember, he's a leader of a 10-nation coalition called the Old Revived Roman Empire. And it's very powerful. So he comes to Israel and says, now we can give you peace. We can offer you peace and we'll protect you from all these other nations. So they signed a 7-year peace treaty with him. But it says that the midpoint of that, he breaks the treaty. Declares himself to be God, moves into the temple that's been rebuilt on the Temple Mount. Tribulation Temple is what we call it. And in Matthew 15, Jesus said, or 24:15, he says, anytime you hear that and you're a Jew, get out of town as fast as you can, because they're going to try to kill every Jew they can. Well, this battle is going to occur sometime between that first 3.5 years that he made that peace treaty. And so they knew that then he couldn't protect them. But who protects Israel? God. God, when you read this, I want y'all to read that. Read verse 38 and 39, or chapter 38 and 39 for next week. You'll find that God rains down 125-pound hailstones on them. Now, I saw softball-sized hail hit my house. This big. And it went right through the deck. Well, you can imagine a 125-pound hailstone, and you had 1 million of them falling, what it will do. It will pepper everything. So anyway, well, thank you for joining me. Join me down in the next service. We're going to be talking about walking worthy of the Lord. Colossians chapter 1, 9 through 20. And tonight I'll be talking about the rapture of the church, the pre-trib rapture. 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 18. Thank you. God bless you, and we'll see you again.